This lesson touches on a very important aspect of language and literacy development, vocabulary. When working in diverse classrooms, we're often challenged to meaningfully interact with English-limited students using grade-level content area language. Meanwhile, we have on-level and advanced learners in the same classrooms that seem to have a reasonably good command of the language of instruction and of the subject area. So how do we bridge the gap to ensure that all students are getting access to the knowledge, skills, and understandings that are intended in the course standards? And how do we measure that growth? Focusing on vocabulary development is a valuable tool in your toolkit, regardless of the subject area that you teach, because it can be used to answer both of those questions. In this course, we'll take a look at research, theory, strategies, and tips that you can start using right away to improve student performance in the P12 classroom. I think most educators would agree that vocabulary plays a critical role in listening and reading comprehension. However, the size and scope of its relevance is often underestimated. Let's begin by examining some interesting facts about vocabulary development. As you read the findings provided, consider the implications for curricular planning and instruction. Classrooms are filled with a variety of language types that require our awareness and attention. Though they vary in form and function, students must become proficient in each in order to fully engage in learning. First, we have content language, which includes the academic vocabulary used in a field of study. For example, in math, we use words like multiply, divide, sum, slope, and variable. Whereas in science, words like density, atom, evaporation, and cells take center stage. Each discipline has its own unique lexicon, a collection of words that convey specific meaning relevant to the subject area. These are words that we commonly see on worksheets, in textbooks, and on tests. They are words that can really make or break a learner's ability to master the concepts that you've targeted in your standards-based lesson plans. In fact, research suggests that approximately 85% of standardized test scores are based on how well students know the vocabulary of the standards. But these words aren't the only potential barriers to understanding, nor are they the only words that comprise that critical 85%. We also use process or function language, which includes symbolic information about behavioral and performance expectations. Examples include words like interpret, summarize, describe, compare, contrast, and analyze. What's tricky about process vocabulary is that oftentimes these words carry multiple meanings, and these meanings vary depending on when and how they're used. For example, a student might interpret data in a science classroom, interpret a poem in language arts, and interpret a meeting for a non-English speaking parent all in the same school day. A third type of classroom vocabulary that can create confusion is idiomatic expression. These culturally informed statements, while often quite useful, can be extremely confusing to students who do not have a firm mastery of the majority language and culture. For example, think of all the ways that we use the word up. In a single day, we might ask our students to stand up and look up, which follow a similar pattern of word use. But we might also tell them to pack up their books, straighten up their behavior, look up and answer, settle up on their lunch account, or call up a parent so they can be picked up after school. Americans love to use idiomatic expressions, and we often don't realize how frequently they show up in our speech. These patterns can and should be learned by students as a feature of language arts instruction. However, as teachers, it is important that we take time to critically examine our use of idiomatic expressions when striving to teach all language learners. An additional form of vocabulary that we use in every classroom is related to English structure. Structural elements include word parts such as prefixes, suffixes, and base words. We often use knowledge of these meanings to help students interpret new vocabulary. But since English is derived from a combination of Latin and Greek, the rules are not always clear and cannot always be applied with fidelity. For example, the prefix in means in or into in words like income and inland. However, it also means not in words like indescribable or indestructible. When students are learning new vocabulary, they frequently apply what they already know about language to help understand meaning. It's important to be aware of these features of our language so that we can make these distinctions to enhance learning. While we're on the topic of structure, it is important to know something about the structure of your non-English or limited English-speaking students' native languages, because this can help you better anticipate what aspects of vocabulary development they might find troublesome. For example, in Mandarin Chinese, verbs do not change tense. Instead, the base form of the verb remains unchanged, and particles are used to situate an action in the past, present, or future. Chinese-speaking ELLs often struggle with English verb tense as the result of this difference. Likewise, Spanish speakers use the same alphabet letters as English speakers, but the sound and letter combinations differ. For example, Spanish vowels make only one sound, with the E and I being especially confusing for ELLs because their sounds in English are the exact opposites of the very same letter sounds in Spanish. Spanish-speaking ELLs sometimes struggle with spelling, vocabulary, fluency, and reading comprehension in their early stages of second language acquisition because they apply Spanish phonics and pronunciation to English words. Since a child's native language phonological awareness is typically well established in infancy, these differences must be explicitly taught as part of a student's literacy and second language development. A final vocabulary consideration is the use of cognates. Cognates are words that have similar pronunciation and meaning in two languages. We often find English cognates in other Latin-based languages, like Spanish and French. In fact, about 40% of Spanish vocabulary has an English cognate. Likewise, linguists estimate that between 35 and 60% of all English nouns are of French origin. For students whose languages do not share English cognates, it is a useful exercise for them to use direct translation or bilingual word association when learning new vocabulary. We'll take a look at vocabulary building strategies later in this lesson. Incidentally, it's important to be aware that not all words shared by two languages carry the same meaning. These are called false cognates. A memorable example is embarazada, which sounds like embarrassed in English. Embarazada is the Spanish word for pregnant. Clearly, false cognates can cause a lot of confusion and perhaps even embarrassment when applied incorrectly. Let's stop and process what we've covered so far. Think about a standards-based lesson that you plan to teach in the near future. In terms of vocabulary development, what words might you target for direct instruction after considering the types of vocabulary described thus far? Make a list of words that would fit into each category: content, process, idiomatic expressions, structure, and, if applicable, cognates. A graphic organizer is provided for this exercise. Now that you've identified the target language for your lesson, let's think about your list in terms of how vocabulary can be approached to meet Oklahoma academic standards. Doing so can help improve student performance, self-confidence, and yes, even test scores. In fact, one study showed that after 2 years of systematic vocabulary instruction, ELLs closed the gap in vocabulary and comprehension that existed between their performance and that of native speakers by about 50%. As you generate ideas about how to strategically incorporate vocabulary instruction into your lesson plan, consider the following best practice strategies. Engage learners by appealing to a variety of learning preferences. Use a variety of grouping patterns. Select activities that directly support content and language objectives. Provide time for meaningful practice of target vocabulary through listening, speaking, reading, and writing. Use words in context, both orally and in writing. And model written language, both orally and in writing. We've all experienced students, whether ELL or otherwise, who seem to know more than they can express verbally. This speaks to the very nature of language arts instruction, which is taught formally as a subject area but can easily be supported within and across the broader curriculum. Similarly, we've probably all worked with a struggling student and wondered whether his challenges were language-related or a problem with learning in general. It's important to understand that many of the struggling learners in Oklahoma classrooms, whether ELL or native speakers of English, come to school with limited vocabularies. Research identifies several issues that can affect vocabulary development. Among these are home environment, socioeconomic status, cultural discourse styles, and the educational and literacy levels of children's parents and caregivers. With these things in mind, we must actively respond to our students' needs by exposing them to language-rich, standards-based teaching that focuses on literacy, critical thinking, and oral language development. All of these skills require a systematic and intentional approach to vocabulary development across the curriculum. If you consider the vocabulary list that you generated during the break, you may find it easy to think of creative ways for students to learn and practice the target vocabulary. We know that children come to school with a variety of learning styles, do best with varied grouping patterns and activities, and need time to practice new words in context. We also know that every lesson we teach should include listening, speaking, reading, and writing in ways that employ target vocabulary and standards-based concepts. This idea is worth repeating because it can have a dramatic impact on your students' performance. Every lesson that you teach should incorporate listening, speaking, reading, and writing in ways that are substantive, meaningful, and related to the standards that you have targeted for the day's instruction. The next step, and one that you might not have considered, is whether students can demonstrate their mastery of the core standards through specific learning objectives per standard in ways that require language mastery and in ways that are not dependent upon language proficiency. For example, a student in language arts who can put words into alphabetical order can demonstrate his understanding of that process without needing to know the definition of each term. By contrast, the same student must know words, meaning, and part of speech in order to use target vocabulary correctly and in context in a written or spoken sentence. A student who correctly illustrates the water cycle in science class can demonstrate his understanding of that process without using language, whereas the same student, when asked to explain the water cycle, may grow silent if he lacks the language skills to do so. When writing standards-based learning objectives, it's helpful to differentiate between content and language performance goals by focusing on the verbs used in your plan. Remember, content objectives should identify what conceptual or subject area knowledge a student can gain as the result of the lesson or unit. Mastery of these concepts can be demonstrated in ways that are language-free or language-reduced. Examples of verbs used for content objectives include, but are not limited to, such words as match, map, illustrate, create, solve, identify, sort, organize, and select. To illustrate this idea, a student can demonstrate the concept of punctuation use to separate items in a series by inserting commas into a sentence or sentences that have been provided for him. The sentences provided could use new vocabulary and context to foster vocabulary development and reinforce comprehension. Asking a student to correctly insert commas into the sentences provided is a content objective, a language-reduced activity aimed at identifying whether or to what extent the student understands this comma rule. ELLs can think critically to successfully master this objective far before their second language proficiency would enable them to write original sentences to demonstrate the same knowledge. Nevertheless, you will come away with a firm understanding of whether the student understands the concept and thus meets the standard. By contrast, objectives that require language mastery use verbs like describe, defend, explain, write, listen for, discuss, read, and recite. The student from the previous example could demonstrate mastery of the same comma rule by writing original sentences using punctuation to separate items in a series. What's more, he could incorporate content vocabulary from your standards-based lesson plan to practice using new words in context. This exercise is more linguistically complex. Asking a student to write original sentences with the correct use of commas to separate items in a series is an example of a language objective. It gives the learner an opportunity to practice thinking and writing in English, and it gives you an opportunity to identify the learner's relative strengths and weaknesses with respect to English language and literacy development. The key here is to make sure that your assessment aligns with your target objective. If your goal is to determine whether the student can use commas properly, other errors in the sentences produced serve as anecdotal evidence for use in planning future lessons. Recognizing your students' efforts, providing specific feedback, and focusing on mastery of specific learning goals in each lesson can dramatically increase the motivation and engagement of struggling learners. Now that you've given this idea some thought, stop the video and take a moment to brainstorm a list of verbs that can be employed when writing learning objectives for the lesson you've been working with during this session. A graphic organizer for this exercise has been provided as a download. When practicing standards-based instruction, it's important to differentiate between what a student should know and be able to do with respect to content knowledge and what the same student is expected to do linguistically to demonstrate that knowledge. If you plan for instruction in these terms, you'll be able to create a feedback loop whereby you're better able to identify skill sets that need further attention, assign grades that accurately reflect what students know and can do, and select activities that reinforce your planned objectives. A feedback loop begins with thoughtful lesson planning, followed by effective lesson delivery. Upon the completion of a lesson, we formally or informally assess student progress by evaluating mastery of the prescribed objectives. The final step is to synthesize the data. By identifying whether or to what degree our students have mastered the prescribed objectives, we can then plan subsequent lessons that will reinforce developing skills as we move to approach new standards. Research consistently shows that struggling students respond extremely well to standards-based instruction when lessons are planned with the feedback loop in mind. Let's stop for a moment to connect these ideas with what we've covered in the previous segment. For this activity, you'll need to select one Oklahoma academic standard from among those outlined in the lesson plan that you brought with you today. Select one Oklahoma academic standard for your upcoming lesson plan. What performance-based objectives could be used to measure content knowledge without the use of or with limited use of language? What objectives could be used to determine whether students have mastered the requisite language skills to convey that knowledge? Here's a helpful hint. The verbs used in your objectives are key. If you're requiring students to match, illustrate, select, map, or demonstrate, you are addressing content objectives. However, if your objectives include verbs like write, describe, listen for, or explain, they are language objectives because they require production of English using either receptive or expressive vocabulary. Receptive vocabulary refers to the bank of words we instantly recognize when listening to someone speak or when reading independently, whereas expressive vocabulary is the bank of words we use to communicate when speaking or reading. You might notice when ELLs participate in language-dependent activities, they sometimes engage in code switching. That is to say, they randomly transition back and forth between their native languages and English as they interface with the subject matter and with their peers. Code switching is an important developmental process for ELLs that can improve cognition and enhance second language development. Many teachers erroneously think that ELLs should be required to work exclusively in English, but an expansive body of research reveals that this approach actually slows down their learning process because it limits their critical thinking to ideas that can be expressed in a language in which they are not fully proficient. A combination of structured activities, performance accountabilities per student, and good classroom management skills can keep ELLs on track, engaged, and motivated while working bilingually to master prescribed objectives. This exercise has facilitated your thinking with respect to the initial planning phase of the feedback loop. Now, let's use the same Oklahoma academic standard, along with the objectives you've just created, to prepare for lesson delivery, assessment of student mastery of the prescribed objectives, and potentials for future planning. Since many of the standards must be taught over time, it is realistic to expect some overlap across lessons within a unit, as well as with units across a curriculum. How will you deliver instruction to ensure that the goals you've identified will be met? How will you objectively determine whether each goal that you've identified for the standard has been met? Once you've measured learning, how might you use that information to inform your next lesson? Now that we've examined vocabulary as a means to teach all language learners, let's take a look at some vocabulary building strategies in use in diverse classrooms.